When I was in Shantou, they served me a broth, durian and chicken tong, you know. I was a bit skeptical, in fact, horrified by the thought. You don't want to be his enemy. I watched the way he went after some of his opponents, and nope, you don't want to be his opponent. Yeah. We should be watching MBS carefully. He's doing to Saudi Arabia in a smaller way what Deng Xiaoping did for China, really altering the guard of the country. If they can stop China, they will try to stop China. But I think it's too late. How can you?
喺睇片之前，大家記得分享、讚好同訂閱灼見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁你就唔會錯過我哋嘅最新影片。
I remember when the framework agreement between ASEAN and China was signed in Phnom Penh in 2002. I was there.朱鎔基made two remarks. He said, if after 10 years the agreement is too much in China's favor, we will renegotiate. This is unheard of in trade negotiations. No country does that. I thought, oh. Then he added, China does not seek for itself an exclusive position in Southeast Asia. In other words, he knew that Southeast Asians are promiscuous. So a relationship with China would not lock us into an exclusive relationship with China. He knew that in Southeast Asia, our instincts are to be friends with everybody. With the Americans, with the Japanese, with the Koreans, with the Indians. Even if Martians come on Earth, we will be friends with Martians. This is the instinct of Southeast Asia. To threaten nobody, but if you push us too much, you'll find us moving closer to your rivals. And then when you let up, we will let up. The Thais are master at this. And they balance the French and the British so carefully, they will never colonize. But this is Southeast Asia's instinct. Yes, China may be building Indonesia's infrastructure. But do you think Indonesia is in China's pocket? Never. In the Malay Annals, which is the history of Malacca, you know, Malacca grew because Ming China needed the Straits of Malacca. Those were the days of Zheng He's voyages. And the early sultans made 3 to 4 tribute missions to Nanjing, all carefully recorded, flattering China. So China thought that they really acknowledged China as overlord. They did not. To their own people, what did they say? Now, this is a story from Sejarah Melayu, the Malay Annals. It says, the Chinese emperor was very sick, and the court physicians could not heal him. So one day someone whispered into the emperor's ear to say, look, the only way you can cure your illness is to implore the Sultan of Malacca to give you his used foot bath water. And if you bathe in it, you will be healed. Accordingly, an imperial envoy was sent to Malacca. So Sultan deigned to listen to the request and finally agreed to let his used foot bath water be sent to Nanjing, into which the emperor had his ablution and was cured. And since then, the relations between Malacca and China were very good. This is how Southeast Asians explain their relationship with China to their own people. And I tell the Chinese this in case they believe the flattery. But economically, between China and Southeast Asia, the economic integration is profound. This year, we have reached $1 trillion. More than US-China trade, more than China-Europe trade, more than US-Europe trade. And will continue to diverge. We're in the same time zone, more or less. One is dry, temperate, the other is wet, tropical, equatorial. You know the durians? The Chinese are eating durians by the container loads. When I was in Shantou, they served me a broth, durian and chicken tong, you know. I was a bit skeptical, in fact, horrified by the thought. Then gingerly tested it. Oh, in fact, it's quite a successful combination. So I posted it on my Facebook. Some of my compatriots back home said, yucks! you know, the Chinese will experiment, and they will come up with new durian products. And just as once upon a time, oil palm estates took over from rubber estates, Durian Estates will take over from oil palm estates as the Chinese market grows. I see this coming. And with China so cold in wintertime, millions will want to own homes in the Philippines and Indonesia. The way Americans flock to Florida at first, and then to the Caribbean, to Mexico. Europeans go down to the Mediterranean, to the Gulf, Russians to Turkey. And there'll be millions of them. Will Southeast Asia, Asians drive China away? No. But what would they do? They said, no, too much Chinese money. You better get some American money in, Japanese money in. So instinctively, they will want diversification. Everywhere along the Belt and Road, countries find their Chinese account growing. So they will tell the Americans and Japanese, please also come. That's what I tell my American friends. If you, instead of forcing a choice, and if you force the choice, you won't get the answer you want, just smile. Everyone will want you in. So with an economy of effort, you can achieve much more with much less. But right now, the Americans and the wider West, they don't like the fact that for the first time in a long time, others are looking them in the eyes and saying, no, we don't agree with you. We have our own values. They don't like that because they are used to being superior, not always in an arrogant way, although sometimes in an arrogant way. But they believe it to be a natural order of things. So the Americans will come with a clipboard. They say, oh, Malaysia 5 upon 10, Indonesia 4 upon 10, Singapore 2 upon 10. And they go around the world. Of course, they are 10 upon 10. Today, when they do that, we just smile. Lee Kuan Yew got a little testy, you know. They were preaching to him. So he said, look, you make me a 51st state and I'll do everything you ask me to do. He was telling them, look, you don't face the consequences, we do. So China's rise is not a threat to America because China has no wish to invade America or to absorb America. But China's rise is a threat to American dominance in the world. Others will look at it and say, no, if China can be independent, we too can be independent. India will be independent. Russia doesn't want to kowtow to the West. In the Middle East, and we should be watching MBS carefully. He's doing to Saudi Arabia in a smaller way what Deng Xiaoping did for China, really altering the gua of the country. And it will have an impact on the entire world. Brazil, Africa. I just read Lee Kuan Yew's old friend, the former president of Nigeria, Obasanjo. Lee Kuan Yew used to meet him and he wanted Lee Kuan Yew to go to Africa. Lee Kuan Yew didn't want to go to Africa. So one day he said, why don't we organize a seminar in Singapore? You call your friends over. So he asked me, he said, Josh, you organize it for me. I did what Brian did for me. So I went around, got to know Obasanjo, but lost touch with him. He must be in his 90s now. He said, the institutions that we import from the West, isn't it obvious that they do not work for Africa? He said, isn't it obvious? Because they do not fit our conditions, our history, our culture. You know, without the rise of China, he wouldn't have said such a thing. But because there is China now, and there's India, so there's also Africa, and the Middle East and Brazil. This multipolar world that we're entering is being born. We can see its rough shape. But the West, particularly the Americans, are fighting it. They rather it not happen. If they can stop China, they will try to stop China. But I think it's too late. How can you? These are ancient peoples in Asia. They have been ahead of the West for many centuries. Why should they not be able to rise again? They're not stupid. They're not unable to organize. But in this process, my fear is the Americans may exhaust themselves. Do you have so much resources? Are your people so productive? What do they depend on? They depend on the US dollar. Because if I can print the dollar, then I can spend. If I need more, I just print more or borrow more. But their servicing cost is going up, and there's inflation. And this may lead to a crisis. One day, with the way they're weaponizing the US dollar and the financial system, there'll be alternatives. The alternative will not be the renminbi. The alternative will be what the world has always been, which is a multiplicity of currencies and species.
If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to extend your support by subscribing to the Master Insight channel so that you will never miss any future videos.
We will still also leave some time for Q&A from audience. So I will try to make my question short and also your answer brief.
Okay. Sorry.
You mentioned about the San Francisco summit. For me, it's really quite astonishing. You know, I just come from Washington, and the atmosphere is so hostile to China. I think that we are really in the middle of the Cold War, new Cold War. But just think about that. American president gave warm welcome, show respect to the head of the enemy country. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Now, what surprised you the most? Or is there any surprise at all for this meeting?
Well, this meeting culminated many months of hard work by both sides to put relationship on a stabler footing and to prevent a further slide in bilateral relations. Biden met Xi Jinping over 3 hours in Bali a year previously with simultaneous interpretation. So it was 3 solid hours of communication. But a little balloon came over and the whole thing got blown off course. So obviously, the agreement was not well anchored. So this time around, much more preparatory work has been made. And what's driving it is presidential elections in the US. Because if there's something wrong with the global economy and they don't have China's cooperation, Biden will lose. Trump will come back. Even with all this, Biden may still lose. So there's a 50-50 chance. And we've got to work on either possibilities.
Singapore is a multi-ethnic nation, has been quite successful. Do you have anything to share with us in that regard?
Singapore is not intelligible in itself. Singapore is intelligible only as a node in a regional global network. So to understand Singapore, you have to understand the network in which Singapore is a node with synaptic connections to different parts of the web. This is Singapore. So if you try to reduce Singapore to a Keynesian analysis of C plus I plus G, when in fact, what explains it is X minus M, not C plus I plus G. So I find many analyses of Singapore limited because of the concentration of Singapore. It's not intelligible in itself. And the Singapore government has not that much flexibility. It's got to operate within the spaces afforded it by a larger environment. And it cannot create those spaces, but it can find those spaces.
Singapore is a government that works, as many of us think. It's had a had a great run. But you said the world's in transition. And as Chief Justice Lee said, Singapore's in transition too, including politically as well as in other ways. What do you see going forward, given multipolar world and how it's developing? What do you see as the 2 or 3 opportunities and challenges for Singapore going forward?
It is a world in flux. We know China will become more important. So we've got to think about opportunities in China. I don't think we can compete inside China with Chinese companies. But China meets the world in a million places. And in those million places, Singapore, in some of those places, Singapore can play a role between China and Southeast Asia, between China and the West, between China and say, Chinese communities elsewhere. And these opportunities will have to be discovered by the private sector. So Singapore's approach, like Hong Kong, is to be rooted in multiple civilizations. For Hong Kong, it is China and the world outside China. For Singapore, it is China, Southeast Asia, India, the US, Europe. And if we are rooted in multiple civilizations, then there are many arbitrage opportunities for us, whether it's in technology or in trade or in manufacturing. We'll always be able to make a living by moving to the boundary, because where there's a boundary, there are always opportunities.
Thank you. So being a student, naturally, I'm very young and probably naive, but I've actually looked at the life and times of Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, I was 8 when he passed away. So having looked at Lee Kuan Yew's life, I've came across a story of Kissinger and how Kissinger said that actually when he was visiting Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew would have meals, meal plans prepared. So naturally we can see that not only Lee Kuan Yew was very forward-thinking, but he was also very meticulous. So my question is, what are some of the biggest takeaways that we can take from Lee Kuan Yew's not only political, but personal way of thinking and personal philosophy?
My sense of Lee Kuan Yew is when he relates with a person, he first thinks about the power relationship. With Kissinger, it is an intellectual relationship. And he knows that through Kissinger, he has some influence in America. And Kissinger knows that Lee Kuan Yew has some influence in Asia and knowledge. So they learned from each other and they communicated until maybe a year or 2 before he died, regularly. Yeah. So Lee Kuan Yew is quite selective. The people whom he cultivates, he has a very close relationship with Kissinger, with Helmut Schmidt, with George Shultz. These are his old friends. With Chinese leaders, it's always a bit more formal. And he kept up his learning of Chinese in order to be able to communicate effectively with Chinese leaders. With fellow Singaporeans, you don't want to be his enemy. I watched the way he went after some of his opponents, and nope, you don't want to be his opponent. Yeah. You see, we had a difficult relationship with the foreign media, like the Far East Economic Review, The Economist. When they circulated in Singapore, we had an economic hold on them. So in the end, they played ball because they needed revenues. But there was in London, there was an op-ed writer called Bernard Levin. So he used from London to throw stones at Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew got a bit irritated. We sent our replies, London Times refused to publish. So he knew the chairman of the BBC, Mamadou Hassi. And he told Mamadou, can you give me airtime to debate Bernard Levin in London? Bernard Levin chickened out. So he demolished himself by being afraid to debate with Lee Kuan Yew in London on the BBC. But Lee Kuan Yew did not stop there. Because I was with him when he was given the key to the freedom of London. And we were all putting on a white tie and had difficulty with the starch collars. He was already all dressed up and ready to go. So I asked his assistant, where's he going? He's going to the BBC. To do what? To talk about Bernard Levin. And how he chickened out. So this was his amuse-bouche before dinner. You see, that's how implacable he can be towards his opponent. But he was not a sadist. When when he has achieved his political purpose, he lets go. So there was a political detainee who was his rival, Lim Ching-seong. He had a nervous breakdown in prison. And I was told Lee Kuan Yew spoke to the doctor and asked when he was going to Europe. He said, "Can he come back into politics?" The doctor said no. Lee Kuan Yew left the issue. In other words, if you are no longer a political challenge, well, there's no need to be vindictive. Yeah. So I would say he understood power, but he used power with economy.
中意名家分析，記得俾 like 同埋分享，支持同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁就唔會錯過我哋嘅新片。